All right. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the weekly Rebalance. We've got a special episode for you here. We're going to take things a little bit slower today. We've been focusing on a lot of, hot topic issues, some really stressful things going on in the world. We're going to take a step back and focus on mainly cannabis stocks today, explaining our fun background. Thought we would switch things up a little bit, get in the theme for today's episode. How you doing, Ethan?
I'm doing pretty well. How are you doing, Nick?
I'm doing well. Doing
Good.
well.
Well, yeah, let's get into it. We got there's a lot of business in the business news related to this topic. So it's actually quite interesting whether you're into this, whether you are an investor in this market or not. I'm looking
Absolutely.
forward to it.
Yeah, I think this is going to be a really fun episode. Really interesting stuff going on here, especially with, recently. Of course, we had 420 a couple days ago, which usually has people talking about cannabis stocks. It kind of comes up naturally on that day. And then on top of that, we got some pretty big news today, or at least some murmurings of some big news for the cannabis industry, and definitely going to have some large impacts for cannabis stocks. Really, anyone in that space.
Yeah, definitely. Looking forward to talking about it.
Yeah. Well,
Should we first cover the market? We've had a lot of moves there, a lot of exciting stuff going on in the broad market as well.
I know. Yeah. Been a good couple of weeks here for the equity market as a whole.
Yep.
Specifically, some of that stuff that had sold off pretty heavily throughout the Iran conflict.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the S&P hit another all-time high last Friday, pulled back a little bit on Monday, right? With the Iran tensions re-escalating, but we had the NASDAQ have a historic 13-day win streak, which I think was the longest since the early 90s. Was snapped on Monday. And then, yeah, the markets have now fully shrugged off the war in Iran, basically getting rid of the correction, or, erasing that correction and back to record highs.
I know.
Weeks took 4 weeks, basically.
4 weeks. I mean, pulling even further. I mean, looking at today, I mean, what was the NASDAQ? NASDAQ finished up about 1.5% higher, at least. I found that a little bit surprising with some of the news that we had coming out of Iran this morning. I know that, basically the ceasefire, at least from the US's perspective, is an indefinite thing until an agreement is made. But I did see some news about Iran seizing a couple ships in the Strait, which I would have thought would spook markets a little bit more than they did, especially because, I mean, we had such a positive day today. Just kind of surprised that that's not really weighing on the markets in the way that we would typically expect. So definitely seems like the market is shrugging it off and we're looking past this.
Yeah, definitely the war is in the rearview mirror. It seems like it, at least from the current market perspective, with us erasing the correction and being back to all-time highs. I don't think you could be surprised if that was tested again and we had some sell-off. But like you said, today, the early part of this week, we had some of that come into question, and the markets have shrugged it off. So we'll see what happens, but markets are seemingly moving past it and just thinking that this is in the rearview mirror, at least for the time being.
Yeah. And I mean, we're going into earnings season as well. So now we've got some other stories to talk about, other things to drive the stocks here. And big companies coming up here soon. I think next week, it's not NVIDIA next week, but I think we've got Microsoft. Hold on, I've got a list of some stocks here we're watching. Google, Microsoft, Amazon, and Apple all coming next week. And some big news out of Apple here recently too, with their CEO replacement at some point here over the summer. But
yes. Well, and earnings continue to look really, really strong. So that story, the broad trend, the boom in AI, and how that's trickling down to the rest of the economy is still really intact. The Iran war, flipped things around a little bit for a month, basically. And again, it's not that it couldn't be retested, but we've got the economy, the market. There's still a lot of good things going on. We're also leading into we're in a midterm election year, so we're leading up to that. Typically post the election, stock markets do really well. So we've got a lot of potentially exciting, 12 to 24 months. Again, we'll see what happens, but these are, there's the market for now is looking past the volatility from Iran and moving on to bigger and better things, at least it seems. But we'll see how long that holds.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, a whole bunch of stuff going on. We've got a new Fed chair potentially coming in soon, watching those hearings and everything. A whole lot.
Yes.
A
Yeah.
whole lot of stuff.
A whole lot of stuff going on. That is definitely true. The only thing that from an economic perspective, GDP has slowed a little bit from its earlier pace. Unemployment is climbing a little bit, and those are some potential things to keep an eye on. Inflation, also something to keep an eye on. We likely have a lagged effect from the war in Iran and how that affects energy prices and how that trickles down to the rest of the economy. So stuff to watch there. The AI displacement of jobs, that's something to pay attention to beyond, that's not materializing in the next couple of months, but it could materialize over the next couple of years. I saw where I think it was the Verizon CEO was pointing out that he thought that somewhere between 20 and 30% unemployment would be reasonable in, the next decade. I think he quoted by like 2030, something like that, which seems a little maybe outrageous, and I'm not sure that I believe that fully, but there's something to be, I guess, watched there from an unemployment perspective. We'll see how that happens. But the risks are that we still have this K-shaped economy where lower income consumers are under a lot of pressure, and the top income consumers are doing great and dealing with potential inflation and all of these things just fine. But the lower income consumers are struggling, and that's definitely a risk in the economy as well, at least in the United States.
Yep. Yep. Definitely
So,
some things to keep an eye on.
absolutely. Well, some other things to keep an eye on, cannabis stocks.
Yeah,
So
definitely.
let's set the stage for that really quick. I'm gonna pull this up, and then I'm really curious on your thoughts here. The market as a whole, this is, it's a 30 to 40 billion dollar, you know, legal regulated sales of mark, that's the market, right?
Yep.
But if you look at those stocks, the publicly traded available stocks that are participating in this market, right? The price to sales ratio is 0.8, right?
Yeah.
0.8. So they have $1 million in earnings. They're worth $800,000. That's 75% below like the US market, if you use the
Yeah.
S&P 500 as a proxy. What do you, I mean, how is an investor supposed to interpret that? What does that mean, and why? I know there's a bunch of reasons, but that we're going to talk about here, but well, maybe give us some explanation as to why that's the case.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, I think there's a few things, and largely it relates to its legal status right now. I think one of the things that we'll likely compare cannabis stocks to throughout this presentation or throughout our podcast today is the alcohol industry. Just because kind of they're in a similar realm, one's growing, one's kind of declining, one's pretty mature, a large industry in the US, and the other one's still growing. Um, but largely, I think it relates to how regulated the space is. I think the big thing that we're going to talk about today is basically the rescheduling of cannabis being probably the biggest catalyst for a lot of these names to potentially push higher and just for the industry as a whole to grow. Because right now, as a Schedule One drug, there's a lot of limitations on the companies in the cannabis space that is really holding them back from taking off and seeing price to sales ratios that are much more in line with the rest of the market. Because right now they're not able to write off their operating expenses against revenue that they have. So they're taxed at a very high rate. just due to the status of it being a Schedule 1 drug. Now, if they move to a Schedule 3, as Trump signed an executive order back in December, pushing that along. Now it's on the Attorney General, which I know that, basically, I think they're replacing the Attorney General right now, as we had Pam Bondi before, and I don't think they have the full replacement yet. But a lot of news coming out today that is going to come sooner rather than later, pushing cannabis stocks even higher. Major cannabis ETFs having more than a 15% day to day. So I think a lot of what's holding that back, in part, is the classification of it as a Schedule 1 drug, and how the companies that operate in that space are treated right now. Because again, they're not, I think one of the biggest things is they're not able to write off their operating expenses, which really taxes them heavily.
Yeah, exactly. It's crazy. That section 280E of the tax code is what's killing them. And just for some history, did you dive into the history of where that came from?
No, I did not.
So I did a little bit, and it's very interesting. So there was this case back in the 1980s, 1981. Jeffrey Edmondson, he was a convicted cocaine and marijuana dealer, and he filed his federal taxes, and he deducted ordinary business expenses. So scales, packaging, telephones, Vikings tickets, all his entertainment. And the US tax court actually allowed most of the deduction. So the tax code obviously permits expenses for any trade or business, right? And Congress basically got a hold of this and was outraged. So within months after this Edmondson case, they basically passed Section 280E, which prevents this from ever happening. So the law was aimed at criminals, but now in 2026, it basically punishes licensed tax-paying state regulated businesses that are operating in this business, that they cannot deduct the operating these they cannot deduct those type of expenses against their business when they're operating on a Schedule 1 drug. So I mean, that's a huge potential a list of deductions. So there's really one survivor that can be deducted for a business operating in this space, which is their cost of goods sold. So things like cultivation, things tied directly to production, the actual plants, the nutrients, packaging directly on the product, that type of stuff, that is deductible. But the things they can't deduct: rent and utilities, payroll and HR, which is a huge one, marketing and advertising, legal and accounting fees, insurance, technology, software, and executive compensation as well. So literally, I mean, some of the biggest parts here: rent and utilities, payroll and HR, their executive compensation, they cannot deduct those as a business expense. So that they're essentially paying taxes on their gross profit, and their tax burden is exponentially higher than it would be otherwise, which is why you're basically seeing those price to sales numbers on average. It's not worth the sales, the revenue that is brought in. The business isn't even worth as much as they bring in 1 year of sales, because they're taxed. Their tax eats away their entire profit. In fact, a lot of the net profit is actually totally gone in these scenarios, because even though their gross profit was positive, their net profit is negative because of the tax burden.
Yeah, that's really crazy. And I mean, too, you mentioned utilities being one of the things that they can't write off. Energy consumption from cannabis growth is very high. There's a number of different figures I'm finding on this, but I'm seeing a few places reporting that 1% of the US's energy production is consumed by cannabis growth, because it's a very energy intensive business. So that's a pretty big cost for them.
Yeah, exactly. Huge cost for them. So I put together a little example here, and I thought this was really interesting. This was just, can you see my screen now, Nick?
Yeah.
I think I'll talk through this for those that are listening instead of watching and can't see this. But this is crazy when you think of this, right? It's just a simple example. Let's say a normal business and a cannabis business do 10 million in revenue.
Yep.
Your cost of goods sold that we just talked about, $4 million, great. Your gross profit, $6 million. Well, that's where things start to change, right? Operating expenses of $5 million, which would be fairly reasonable, deducted by the normal business, meaning they have a taxable income of $1 million. Well, the operating expenses for the cannabis business totally blocked. So their taxable income is $6 million instead of $1 million. So if you use a federal tax rate of about 21%, you have 210,000 paid for a normal business and 1,260,000 paid for the cannabis business, which means the actual net profit is 790,000 for a normal business and about 21% is their effective tax rate. The cannabis business has a net profit of negative 460,000, basically 126% of their real profit, just totally out the window. So they can't actually make any money in this scenario. And you have, a lot of these businesses struggling where like a normal corporate tax rate might be 21%. Well, you could see really thinly, or negative margins in a lot of businesses. Even the best margins are really, really compressed by this issue.
Yeah. I mean, that example really highlights how important that is.
Yeah, just a silly example, but and totally made up example. I did not base that on
Yeah.
any actual company, but it's obviously oversimplified, but it tells the story pretty well. And that's what they're talking about. That's why you saw today and in December when the executive order came out from Trump, that's why you saw a lot of these stocks that are producing the legal cannabis and products associated with that shot up and did very well. Although there's some nuances around that as well. So,
Yeah. No,
anyways,
there are, and we'll get into those in a minute. I think while we're on the tax subject, another interesting thing I wanted to highlight as well, looking at the overall industry and just comparing it to alcohol as a whole, I found some interesting things coming up there. So I think overall, the big story is cannabis is growing in popularity. That market is expanding. Alcohol as a whole has been declining for a little while now. And that comes from a lot of things, changing consumer preferences being one of them, and the main one. Uh, but one of the things that you find, because you can find information on the market size for the alcohol industry, the cannabis industry. Um, currently, the cannabis legal industry in the U.S. is around $32 billion. That's the estimate that I'm seeing here, and the market size for alcohol in the U.S. is closer to 300 billion. So a long ways to go, and that's probably why you see a lot more growth in the cannabis space as opposed to the alcohol one, because alcohol is much more mature. Um, but one of the funny things that you see, actually, in the state of Illinois, they already pull in more tax revenue from cannabis as opposed to the alcohol industry, and it's because of that 280E restriction. Um,
yeah,
I'm seeing in 2025 they pulled in $452 million in tax revenue from the cannabis industry and $316 million from the alcohol industry.
wow.
Um, and again, these are just numbers that I'm finding online and at various sources. But I just found that really interesting. Now, if cannabis were to be rescheduled, then of course that would probably flip the other direction. But really funny thing to note right now, just with how that 280 restriction really skews things.
Yeah. Yeah, well, it's interesting. So the operators are really they try to soften the blow as much as they can because you can see that. So that's a good example. The alcohol industry is 10x the business that the cannabis industry is. And you were looking at Illinois specifically.
Well, for the tax revenue piece, but that was just the U.S. market. Those are the numbers I'm seeing for the U.S. market.
Yeah, so let's just say 10x, but they're paying the same amount in tax, the cannabis industry is. But yeah, I mean, it's an interesting time. I think a lot, obviously, to soften the blow, are trying to maximize their cost of goods sold, obviously, but you can only go so far there. I've seen a lot of other creative things like different entity separations where they'll split the cannabis touching entity where the 280E
Yeah.
applies and a separate like real estate company that charges fees back to the other company? Like those are, potential workarounds, and just like different states have treated and decoupled from the 280E, but also just not paying it and betting that the IRS will not enforce before they actually change the tax law around this. But that's definitely a risky approach. But I'm sure that some are doing that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't doubt it. It's an interesting industry to study as a whole, seeing
Yeah.
that. And then on top of that too, with moving from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3, other things opening up as well, just research capability, and access to banking too. Because right now it's one of those things, that states have different legislation on it. It's legal for different purposes in different states. And right now it's not necessarily seen as like a very legitimate business. It
Right.
still hasn't gained that legitimacy that other industries have. And moving to Schedule 3 would definitely push it in that direction.
Yeah. Yeah, agreed. Well, the other thing that will happen if it's Schedule 3 is a lot of these companies that we're looking at, and I think you even had a chart that you showed
Yeah.
me earlier that was how they spiked and then have come back down in price since then. What's I think is very interesting to think about though is there a lot of the investable universe at the moment is these smaller companies that most have never heard of unless they've looked into the industry. But what happens if it goes to Schedule 3? Do we not see the Eli Lilly's of the world, all of those major players jump into that business right away? And how well do these small players do? I mean, I guess some of them might be acquisition targets, but
Yeah.
some of them might go by the wayside. How are they going to compete with a Lilly? Like, obviously, Lilly's not touching that market now. That would, if they put any meaningful amount of investment into it, that their profit margins would shrink as associated with the 280E issue. So, but if that changes, what do you think on that? What does that look like for the existing players in the space?
Yeah, definitely a good thing to bring up. And I think we get a glimpse into what might happen to the current rally that we're seeing in cannabis stocks here in the coming days, potentially. Looking back on it, so back in December, Trump signed an executive order basically pushing for rescheduling of cannabis. Um, and obviously, that comes with a lot of benefits for the companies in the space. But like you said, there's a lot of big competitors that are kind of sitting on the wayside that are likely going to pile into the space as soon as it becomes more legitimate. They're able to write off their operating expenses, so on, so forth. And what we saw was these cannabis stocks, they really rallied leading up to the announcement of the executive order being signed and then trailed off afterwards, likely because increased competition is going to come into the space. I mean, even if it's not the major players or all of the major players on day one, as it becomes easier to enter the industry and it's less of a burden, there's obviously going to be more entrants and these companies are going to have much more competition. So last time we saw, real progress towards rescheduling of cannabis. We saw a rally going into it, and then following it, we saw things kind of trail off. So I think there's a couple things going on here. One being, potentially more competition coming into the space, but then also, Trump signed the executive order. That doesn't mean that it gets rescheduled that day. We
Right.
still have to go through the legal process of having that actually happen. So potentially, maybe it was just a lot of excitement going into it, and then trailed off after they realized, oh wait, we're at least months away from having this thing actually make any changes for business here and there. So I think there's a couple things going on there, but I wouldn't be surprised to see some of that impact creep in here, even if we don't see it happen right away. Just as these larger players enter the space and take away market share from these names that have kind of dominated the space up to this point, when it's been more of a difficult industry to operate in.
Yeah, definitely. 100% agree.
Yeah, but that's we'll see. I think it's going to be an interesting one to watch, and we'll see which effect dominates here in the coming days.
Yeah, we'll have to keep watching. Very interesting. And you have it's not necessarily over once it gets reclassified, you
Yeah,
know?
yeah,
That, theoretically switches things for these companies. But, you know, the IRS transition is uncertain. there's no guarantee that the IRS immediately abandons the 280E enforcement after it's rescheduled. There could be, operators probably need explicit IRS guidance on like the transition date, right?
Yep.
And then Congress could theoretically pass legislation to preserve the 280 tax treatment for cannabis businesses even after, it's rescheduled, if it's rescheduled to Schedule 3 drug. Pretty unlikely, but it's possible, right? So it's not just done. And even in this scenario, it's still federally controlled substance under Schedule 3,
Yeah.
right? So the safe banking, the banking issue is still an issue. Like it's not automatic that all these companies are going to be able to be listed on the New York Stock Exchange and the NASDAQ.
Yeah.
It's not like it changes overnight. Just some other things to think about there.
No, definitely. Definitely. We're making steps towards more common business, but does not make it easy by any means.
Right. What's one step at a time. Yeah. That is by far and away though the biggest issue for these publicly traded issue for these any of these, whether they're publicly traded or not. That is by far the biggest issue that they're contending with, at least as operating this as a business, is the 280E schedule issue, with cannabis being a Schedule 1 drug. Just it's almost insurmountable in most cases.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, I think the other thing too, we've covered the rescheduling really closely because I think that's a big thing. But other industry trends that I find really interesting, a lot of these cannabis producers, some of these bigger ones, they're expanding into beverage production. THC infused beverages, things like that, which I find really interesting for a number of reasons. We've talked about how it compares to the alcohol industry, which as a whole has been declining. Um, because people's preferences are changing. I think there's a lot of studies suggesting that people are more likely, or there's more people beginning to use cannabis as opposed to, less and less people drinking on average. But these cannabis companies are expanding into the beverage industry, which I think makes sense because it's still growing and everything like that. But it's kind of funny to me because on the one hand, you've got one industry that's seeing some struggles here recently, and then you've got another that's rapidly growing, even with the existing restrictions that are in place, and they're trying to get into the other industry as well, which, one's mature, the other's not, so it makes sense that they might try to get in there, but find that trend as a whole interesting.
Yeah, very interesting trend.
Yeah. And then the only other thing I was going to highlight, because we had a bit of this on Monday, and I wanted to look back in time and see if this was a consistent effect that we've seen, and I did not find that that was the case. But you may have seen on Monday, cannabis stocks had a pretty good day. MJ, being one of the big ETFs in the space, was up about 6.5%. And it's potential that it's a possibility that there was some news out there that came out relating to rescheduling, things like that, especially after we got these reports today. So maybe there was something out there earlier, but Monday was 420. And it got me thinking, do we have that meme stock effect in the cannabis space as well? Because that's something that I could see happening in the past, and maybe that's just something we weren't aware of.
Yeah, maybe.
And so I looked back because I was interested to see if that was just like a common thing. And typically on business days that are on 420 or the business day following 420, if we had really positive effects for MJ. And I didn't see that. Looking back to 2019, most of these days, for the most part, they're positive, but it's plus 0.4%, plus 0.68%, plus 0.02%, down 0.43%. In recent years, it's gotten a little bit bigger, plus 1.3%, 0.39%, 1.76%, but we really haven't seen that marked market movement from something like MJ that we saw on 420 this year. So I found that interesting. We've seen the meme stock thing kind of creep into Wall Street more and more over the past few years. It's not all that uncommon to see names moving and find out that they're talking about it on Reddit, and that's part of the reason why they're moving. So I'm kind of surprised that we haven't seen that in the past. But I think we had a little bit of that movement on Monday.
Yeah, that's funny. So not a meme, not historically a meme play, but maybe a little bit this year.
Yeah, maybe a little bit this year. It's potential that I looked around to see if there was any other like specific news, specific catalyst that could be pointed to on Monday. I didn't really find a conclusive answer on that. So I'm guessing that we had a little bit of a meme rally there.
Yeah. Funny.
Yeah, very funny.
Awesome. Well, definitely a fun topic to go through. I think most would be, I think a lot of people look at the cannabis industry and just kind of laugh it off, but there's some interesting business and tax information in there as well with the Schedule 280. So glad we were able to mix it up and cover that today.
Definitely. Definitely.
Well, should we move on and do a couple trivia questions? I've got a couple for you.
Let's do it.
Sounds good. I've got at least one good one.
All right. Go for it.
All right. So Canada was the first G7 nation to legalize adult use cannabis nationally. Do you know what year that occurred in?
Ooh. No, I don't. I'm gonna guess like 2008.
It was a little after then. It was actually 2018.
Oh wow. Okay. Way early.
Still, yeah. Still a while ago though. 8 years ago. It was October 17th, 2018. So it's been about 8 years, almost 8 years since that the Cannabis Act took effect on October 17th, 2018.
Guess that makes sense because we did see a lot of major market movement in that space back in 2018 from what I saw. So that makes sense.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Well, that's interesting. Let's see here. I've got another one that's related to 2018. Let's do this one. In 2018, shares of what Canadian cannabis company skyrocketed so high that its market value briefly surpassed that of American Airlines and Clorox?
Is it Tilray?
Yep, Tilray. Hit about a market cap of 20 to 21 billion.
Wow. Down from that now, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, they sold off after that. I think I remember when that happened, and there was a lot of excitement about investing in cannabis as a whole.
Yeah.
I wasn't working in the industry at that time, but I remember on the news they were always talking about it. I had family members talking about it. I remember that time being a exciting point for cannabis stocks.
Yeah. Then they figured out that you can't deduct your operating expenses, and that changed everything.
At least in the US,
Yeah, I guess that's a Canadian company, so maybe, But yep, you're right.
yeah, that's funny. Well, I have one more, unless you've got another one.
I have one more as well.
Okay,
So,
perfect. Let's alternate.
okay, so what percentage of Florida voters approved recreational cannabis in 2024? And why did it still fail?
Well, I'm guessing they were in the majority if you asked why did it still fail. So I'll say 55%.
Yep, 56%. So
Okay.
that's pretty close.
Um, why did it still fail? I'm gonna say there was lobbying from a certain mouse, maybe. I don't know. That's a wild guess. I have no idea, but maybe something weird like that. Maybe Disney didn't want people coming in high and riding roller coasters or something like
That's
that.
right. That's probably right. Actually, Florida requires 60% approval for constitutional amendments to pass. So they needed 4% more to get past the 60% threshold. So that was why, yeah, the majority wanted it, but it still lost.
Interesting. Okay. Well, they're pretty close. They'll probably get that at some point.
Yeah, probably.
Get that at some point. Very interesting. All right, let's see here. I've got one more. Because
All right, sounds
highway.
good.
Okay, perfect. Let's do it. Because highway mile markers labeled 420 kept disappearing, which U.S. state replaced its mile 420 road sign with one reading 419.99 to deter thieves?
I'm gonna guess Colorado.
Yep, it was Colorado.
Not surprising out there in Colorado.
And apparently, I think it worked for a little while, and then people kind of, I think they caught on to the novelty that it was 419.99, and then I think they started taking those too.
They just can't win.
Can't win with that one.
That's really funny. I never heard that before, but that's really funny.
Yeah, that was a funny one.
Yeah, awesome. Well, you got any closing thoughts?
No, no. We'll see what happens in the coming days if it gets rescheduled. What that looks like for the industry, and see what happens.
Yeah. Yeah, we'll have to do a revisit on this maybe later in the year or next year, depending on what happens here.
Definitely. It was a fun topic to look into.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks, Nick, and thanks everybody for listening.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.